Imagine being 13 years old, disappearing from foster care, and days later being found inside a burning vacant house. But the fire was not the cause of death. Investigators say Niyah Baker had been beaten, stabbed, and burned, and two teenage girls, only 15 and 16, were charged in her murder. They knew Niyah, and the more investigators uncovered, the more this case raised a terrifying question. How many chances were missed before a child was lost forever?
This teenage girl right behind me here named Niyah Baker was murdered. The details are gruesome.
We were able to confirm that the young girl found in the burning house on Cardamom Court was that of missing teen Niyah Baker. The manner of death is not an accident, and this is not a suicide. This is a horrible homicide.
On January 15, 2025, firefighters were called to a small structure fire at a vacant house on Cardamom Court in Columbia, South Carolina. They expected smoke, flames, and an empty building. Instead, they found a body on the floor. At first, police did not know who the victim was. The body had suffered such severe trauma to the head, face, and body that visual identification was impossible. And that mattered because, at the same time, a 13-year-old girl named Niyah Baker was missing. Niyah had last been seen in the Hopkins area on January 13th. She was in foster care, and authorities believed she was in danger. Investigators were searching for her while the clock kept moving. Then the body was discovered roughly 20 miles away. The location created a chilling possibility. Could the unidentified girl inside that vacant house be the child everyone was trying to find? Niyah had a history of running away, but investigators did not dismiss her disappearance. Records showed that she had previously been reported missing in Sumter, and she had recently entered foster care in the Columbia area. In the days before her final disappearance, there had been concern about where she was going and who she might be with. According to the Richland County Sheriff's Department, Niyah had left the foster home in Hopkins. She had also recently purchased a phone that her foster family did not know about. Investigators did not know who she had been communicating with, or whether those conversations were connected to her disappearance. The Sheriff's Department began searching for her. A report indicated she had left sometime around the overnight hours, and investigators developed information that she might have traveled toward Columbia. The area around Faro Road and Beltline Boulevard became part of the search. The warning signs did not begin in January. Reporting indicates Niyah had been reported missing in Sumter during the previous summer. In July 2024, she left home during the early morning hours and was later found safe. About a month later, she again missed curfew and could not be reached before turning up the next day. At some point afterward, she entered foster care and was moved away from the environment she had known. That history matters, but not because running away makes a child responsible for what happens to them. It matters because it shows how complicated Niyah's situation had become before the final disappearance. She was 13, moving between environments, and already difficult for the adults around her to keep track of. When she disappeared for the final time, investigators were not simply looking for a teenager who had decided to stay out late. They were looking for a vulnerable child whose whereabouts were unknown, while another chain of events was unfolding around two other teenagers. And that is where this case becomes more than a murder investigation. It becomes a story about what happens when warning signs appear separately, scattered across different agencies and different lives, until they suddenly converge in one terrible place. But there was another disturbing coincidence. On January 12th, the same day Niyah was reported missing from her foster placement, a 16-year-old girl in Columbia was also reported missing by her mother. That teenager was not simply a missing child with no history. Police later said she had prior contact with law enforcement and had been under the supervision of the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice. She was supposed to be wearing an ankle monitor. Then she cut it off. Authorities had a pickup order for her return to juvenile custody, but she was out on the streets. A second teenager, 15 years old, was also known as a frequent runaway. She had recently left school and had prior contact with law enforcement. Both girls were somewhere in Colombia while Niyah was missing. And then police revealed something that changed the case completely. Niyah knew the two girls. They were not strangers who happened to cross paths with her. Authorities described them as acquaintances. Exactly what that relationship involved, investigators did not publicly explain. A motive was not released. But suddenly, the disappearance of a 13-year-old and the movements of two runaway teenagers were connected to the body inside that abandoned house. On the night of January 15th, firefighters arrived at the vacant property after smoke was reported. But inside, firefighters found a deceased person. Police began treating the death as suspicious. Then the forensic examination revealed something far more horrifying. The victim had suffered severe injuries that were unrelated to the fire. According to Richland County Coroner Niyah Rutherford, the girl had been bludgeoned, stabbed, and burned. Her official cause of death was blunt force trauma. The fire had not killed her. The question became whether someone had deliberately set it to conceal what had already happened. But investigators still had to answer one basic question: who was the victim? Authorities compared photographs of missing and runaway teenagers. None appeared to match. The problem was the extent of the injuries. Rutherford explained that the trauma to the victim's head, face, and body was so severe that the photographs did not appear to match what investigators were seeing. That meant science had to speak where eyesight could not. Investigators worked with the sheriff's department and the coroner's office. Dental records were used, and DNA evidence connected to Niyah was collected for comparison. The result came back. The girl inside the vacant house was Niyah Baker. She was 13 years old. And now there was no longer any question about what had happened. The coroner ruled her death a homicide. It was not an accident. It was not suicide. Niyah had been violently attacked, and the fire came after the fatal violence. On January 18th, Columbia Police Chief Skip Holbrook stood before reporters and described the killing with words that showed how difficult it was even for an experienced law enforcement official to discuss. Brutal, heinous, gruesome, and disturbing. Then came the arrests. Two girls, 15 and 16 years old. Both were charged with Niya's murder. The 16-year-old was the same teenager who had been reported missing by her mother on January 12th. Police said she had a history that included disorderly conduct and malicious injury, and that she had previously been in juvenile justice custody. She had been wearing an ankle monitor. She allegedly removed it and disappeared. Police said the 15-year-old was also a frequent runaway and had recently stopped attending school. The allegations were shocking because of the ages involved. These were not adult suspects with decades of criminal history. They were teenagers accused of participating in the killing of another teenager who was only 13. And investigators confirmed that Niyah knew them. Still, the public did not receive the answer everyone wanted most. Why? Why Niyah? Why that house? What happened between the girls? And why was the body burned? Those questions remained unanswered publicly. Fifth Circuit Solicitor Byron Gibson said his office intended to petition family court to have the two suspects prosecuted as adults. But that process was not immediate. The case moved into the juvenile justice and court system, with questions about competency evaluations and how the suspects would ultimately be handled. Meanwhile, another question began to emerge, and it was larger than the murder itself. How had all of this been allowed to happen? Niyah was a child in foster care. Her alleged attackers were teenagers who, according to police, had already been known to authorities. One had been under juvenile justice supervision and was supposed to be wearing an ankle monitor. Both were described as frequent runaways. The system surrounding these children had records, warnings, and points of contact. But none of those safeguards prevented the final encounter. Chief Holbrook urged parents to be involved in their children's lives, to know where they were, who they were with, and what they were doing. His comments became part of a wider discussion about parental involvement, youth violence, and the failures that can occur when vulnerable children move between families, schools, foster care, and law enforcement. Columbia leaders also questioned the vacant property itself. Why was the house unsecured? Who owned it? Who was responsible for checking on it? How many other abandoned properties across the city were sitting empty and accessible? A memorial soon appeared outside 114 Cardamom Court. Flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten messages were placed where Kaniah's life had ended. But the case was not finished. Months after the murder, another development brought the story back into the headlines. In September 2025, the 16-year-old suspect escaped from the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice's detention complex in Columbia. She was being held in connection with the murder case. The Richland County Sheriff's Department was alerted around 6 that evening, and deputies began searching. Nearly 3 hours later, investigators located a vehicle near Wilson Boulevard and Sharp Road. Inside was the escaped teenager, and beside her was her mother, 39-year-old Savannah Mills. Deputies also found 2 firearms in the vehicle. One was reported stolen in Richland County. The teenager was arrested and returned to juvenile detention. She also faced an additional escape charge. Her mother was arrested as well, accused of aiding the escape of a prisoner facing a capital offense. She initially posted a $10,000 bond and was released, but investigators later added charges involving a stolen firearm and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. A judge then set a much higher bond of $150,000, along with GPS monitoring and house arrest. Sheriff Leon Lott reacted angrily to the circumstances, saying it shocked him that a mother who knew what her daughter was accused of doing would allegedly help her get away. And that created another disturbing layer to a case already filled with questions about adults, children, supervision, and responsibility. But while prosecutors and investigators dealt with the legal case, people in the community were trying to make sure Kaniah was not reduced to a headline. Devon and Tavon Woods, twin brothers from Sumter, had grown up in foster care themselves. They founded Foster Kids Matter, an organization focused on children in the foster system. When they learned that a 13-year-old foster child from their own hometown had been murdered in Columbia, they decided to act. In February, they traveled to the area and organized a walk near the house where Kaniah was found. People joined them, walking near the memorial that had formed outside the property. Their message was simple: Kaniah's name should not disappear. Later, the brothers returned for a 5-mile walk connected to what would have been Kaniah's 14th birthday. They wanted the community to remember that stories like this often dominate attention for a few days, then vanish as the next headline arrives. They promised to keep coming back, and that may be the most important part of this case, because the unanswered questions are still there. What happened between Kaniah and the 2 girls she knew? What led them to that vacant house? Why did the violence become so extreme? Why was a fire set afterward? And what could have been done differently before 3 teenagers ended up connected by a crime that should never have happened? There are no easy answers. Kaniah's history of running away does not explain her murder. Her time in foster care does not explain her murder. The histories of the 2 suspects do not explain their alleged actions, and none of those details should become a reason to shift responsibility away from the people accused of killing her. What they do show is a chain of warning signs surrounding vulnerable teenagers. Kaniah Baker deserved protection, not a memorial outside an abandoned house. She deserved adults who knew where she was, people who recognized when she was vulnerable, and a future that lasted far beyond 13. Her story should not be remembered only for the brutality of her death. It should be remembered for the questions it forces us to ask about children who disappear, children in foster care, teenagers already moving through the justice system, and the warning signs that can be missed until it is too late. The 2 suspects were teenagers. Kaniah was a teenager. But only one of them never got the chance to grow up, and that is why, months later, the questions surrounding Kaniah Baker's murder remain as disturbing as the crime itself. Who knew she was in danger? Who knew where she was? Who was she with? And when those answers finally mattered, was anyone close enough to stop what happened? Kaniah's name remains. The memorial remains. The questions remain. And until the full story is known, the silence surrounding those unanswered questions may be the most haunting part of all.